David Bennett, thank you very much for talking to me this morning. In your presentation to the conference, you were concentrating on the balance really between integration and competition. For the uninitiated, could you explain to us what you understand by the term integration and what priority Monitor places on integration in the grand scheme of things?
Well, probably the starting point is our fundamental duty as set out in the new legislation, which is to promote and protect the interests of patients. But underneath that, one of the specific things we have to do is to enable the provision of integrated services. So integration of services, and that's the key thing, the integration of the services that people get, is going to be a very important part of what we have to do. So we do indeed need to work out what that means, and I think lots of people have very different views about what it might mean. In its most simplest form, it can be nothing more than making sure that if a patient has to move from one provider of care to another provider of care as they are looked after, that the information about that patient is transferred from provider to provider, from the GP to the hospital to maybe community services and so on. So it can be something as simple but not always as easy as we might hope as that, right the way through to getting multiple providers, hospital consultants, district nurses, GPs, all sorts of people to work together to make sure the patient gets a completely seamless provision of care that really produces the best possible outcomes for them. So integration is very important, but exactly what it means we need to work out. And frankly, the commissioners of services, particularly GPs, are going to have to play a very important role in working out what is going to be best. But also, we have to ask patients, we have to understand what they themselves want. On the competition front, many people have been concerned that competition and integration might be in conflict. I don't think that's true.
In terms of the potential tools that Monitor might have at its disposal to promote integration, what would those be?
Well, again, to a large extent, we need to work this out. Now, you were asked in your first question about competition as well as integration. So I think one of the things we need to say is that competition, or more to the point, often patient choice, which is what really matters to patients from the point of view of competition, is something that needs to work alongside integration. Many people have expressed concerns that it could actually get in the way of effective integration. So one of the things we need to do is to understand how it might get in the way and make sure that whether there's a net benefit for patients from integration, that competition rules don't get in the way of providing that integrated service. So there's one of the things we need to do, is to understand where there might be problems and try to make sure there aren't. There are things I'm sure we can do, however, to more directly encourage integration of services. A lot of it will have to do with the commissioning board, because an awful lot of this integration of services is going to be driven by commissioners, which is where the commissioning board has, of course, a central role to play. Sort of things we could be doing with them is working out what sort of areas are best for providing integrated care, what the integrated care should look like, and then just telling commissioners this is the sort of thing that we think you might be looking at, although I would always stress that the commissioners should first and foremost be listening to what their patients say. But we could then be doing things like designing with the commissioning board integrated packages of care and pricing those. That can be a way then to help commissioners who need to procure the services on behalf of their patients. We could be looking at ways of using pricing to incentivize different providers of care to work closely with each other, which we know is one of the most important things that we need to see more of. We could be encouraging specific experiments, pilots, demonstrator schemes, where we agree perhaps with a provider or a set of providers, or with their commissioners, maybe with both, that we will in effect suspend the rules on competition for a while whilst they test out new ideas, and then we can evaluate what's working, what's not working, what are the benefits of the integrated service. Have we lost out from not having choice? If so, are there ways of reintroducing choice without losing the benefits and so on? So many different things, but we really will have to do a lot of work and a lot of consultation to work out exactly what we're going to do.
And what would you say to the sceptics out there that say, it's an either-or thing, you can either have competition or integration, but not both?
I really think that isn't true. And you're right, there are a lot of people who have made that argument. I think in many cases because they're misunderstanding what people mean when they talk about competition. But just to give some examples of how the two can work together, you can have something that we call competition for markets, which sounds rather grand, but it's really very simple. This is where commissioners may say, here's the care that we want to provide, the integrated care that we want to make available to our patients. We now need to decide who's going to provide it, and it might be a single provider, it might be a group of providers working together. In order to decide who to use it, they might use some sort of competitive tendering process. They may say, this is what we want. To any provider who thinks they can provide this, you tell us how you would do it, what sort of care you'd provide, what sort of quality you can guarantee, and so on. The commissioner then decides who to use and then makes the best of those providers available to patients. That's competition, but it's competition working to provide integrated care for patients. You can even go beyond that. There are many people arguing, and I think often persuasively, that in many cases the patient themselves is in the best position to decide what is the best integration of care for them. Individual budgets where a patient is given money that they can then spend to buy the different elements of the care that they need, those individual budgets can be a way of them constructing their own integrated care. You can use choice and the competition that goes with it to have multiple providers for each bit of the care, so the patient can actually choose not only what bits of care they need integrated appropriately, but they can actually decide which provider they use for which element.
What would you say to, again, some of the sceptics out there that might view that scenario you just described as being ideal for a kind of middle-class, middle-aged person who speaks English fluently, as opposed to some of the more vulnerable people in society? How would you balance that against the equity issues that raises?
You're right, there are equity issues. And this actually is a common problem in many areas of public policy, that the challenge of using forces like choice to drive up the quality of what's provided, whilst not disadvantaging those who, as some people will say, don't have sharp elbows. Well, we should never be designing a system where having sharp elbows, is the way to be successful, but it may be a challenge, and we've got to find ways of dealing with it. Now, one strong argument is that if some patients, some users of a service, drive the quality of the providers up, even if it is by being challenging and forceful, in many ways that drives up the quality of, in this case, care for everybody. So it's not necessarily a bad thing, but you're right, it can be the case that those who are less able to choose what's in their best interests could lose that. And this is where, again, I think commissioners and GPs in particular need to be there to work with patients to make sure they're best able to get the care available to them. And something that commissioners may want to think about is whether they don't even need explicitly to provide individuals who can work with those that are at a disadvantage to help them choose their care. So even if it's not the most effective use of the GP's time, maybe they could provide specialists who could help. So there are many ways this could happen. We need to work out what will be best. But we do need to be alert to that problem, I agree.
Part of the discussion following your talk centred on the issue of IT, and as you know, for many years in the NHS we've been looking forward to having a single electronic record which could potentially promote competition if patients are able to move from provider to provider, and collaboration if all members of the healthcare team are sharing a common record. The Department of Health has recently admitted that it doesn't think it's going to be able to deliver shared records. Is that a problem?
Well, let me start by saying that this issue of getting effective sharing of information between different providers of care is a very important part of this whole story about integration. Similarly, actually, improving the quality of care means making information readily available to commissioners and people who use the services. So information is incredibly important, and that will only increase over time. Therefore, we do need the information systems that make this possible. So one way or another, we've got to move this thing on. Yes, we've had an effort that hasn't quite produced the results that people were looking for, but we must not, absolutely must not let that get in the way of finding alternative solutions.